Hey y'all, welcome to the Clock Tower. I'm Colton here with Brandon. Over the last weekend, we had the MTI release tournament, and a week ago, we had a couple more Springfest Trios regionals to talk about. So we'll talk about the MTI tournament first. Ended up with 37 players. The initial signups filled the tournament field, so there was a waiting list, but only about half of the players that actually signed up ended up participating. So everyone who was on the wait list and wanted in got in. And I think the reason that so many people signed up and so many people showed up as opposed to the SDS event is because people were allowed to play whatever they wanted. And it showed. There were a lot of people who weren't playing MTI at the event.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it makes sense to play something that would play into Mushoku Tensei, right? When they announced the tournament, they announced that it was going to be open to every possible listing you could play in English Weiss Schwarz. The incentive to play Mushoku for this tournament was that the winner was going to win an additional prize if they won with the Mushoku Tensei deck.
And that's exactly what ended up happening. We had a single elimination tournament, 6 rounds. A couple of them had buys because of the odd number of players, but ended up with MTI winning the tournament, beating 8 Pants Bang Dream in the final. Another MTI list coming in third. So congratulations to those players. It was a fun event. It was well structured. Bushiroad seems to be comfortable with the remote fight server as a medium for hosting tournaments now. I think that Bushiroad has found its lane with this. And I hope that they do more tournaments like this in the future because there were a lot of new players who participated because it's a pretty low stakes tournament, right? So players were able to play whatever they wanted, whatever they happened to have. It was a beginner friendly environment, but also at the top tables, you were seeing guys playing meta stuff. So overall, I think it's a positive event, and I would like to see Bushiroad continue to host these.
We do have some links for the top three decks here that we'll include in the description. What I think is really interesting to note, the two MTI decks that made top three, that they weren't carbon copies of the same thing, but rather focused on different aspects and parts of it. They were both standby. One ran the event package, one didn't. I just thought that was really interesting to see that both of those types of decks made it to the top, regardless of whether or not they ran the event.
Yeah, it feels like Mushoku Tensei is kind of in the same place that Data Live was in its early days, where it's like, okay, we know what the shell is, what are the tech pieces, we're trying to finalize this list a little bit. And whether or not you play that event package, the blue 1-0 that goes to memory and then allows you to search your deck when you level up, is going to be probably the most significant decision about how the deck ends up being built long term. But in any case, currently, obviously, both builds very powerful. Got 2 of the top 3 at its own event. Once again, congratulations to those guys. And we hope to see more of these Title Cup style events in the future. The weekend before that event, we had 2 more Springfest Trios regionals to talk about. One was in Oberhausen, Germany, and the other near Chicago. Looking at top 8 from Germany, a team featuring Ruby, Fate, and MTI finishes first, and another team with both MTI and Ruby finishes second with Bang Dream as the third. A ton of MTI here. Like, that's, again, the takeaway. Mushoku Tensei in most of these teams, and even more so in the Chicago regional, which took place the same day. 8 standby MTI, another Bang Dream, and Slime, the old Slime, on Pants Book. So, like, kind of a Shizu waifu kind of thing that ran the book Burn 4 top end instead of the salvage top end. Second place went to Slime, a Goblin Slayer, and Mushoku Tensei. And then Mushoku was also on the third team, which featured another 8 standby Slime and a Bofree anti-meta Stocksoul Pants. And not only did MTI feature in all 3 of those teams, it was on every team but one in top 8 in Chicago. Over the course of the first 4 tournaments, it has been 25% of all decks and on 75% of all teams. It has the same representation as Data Live in a room where 2/3 of the players aren't allowed to play it.
Yeah, it is extremely high, and worth noting it's double of the representation count of the next one down regarding totals currently, and we're only through 4. We have another 2 regionals to go before Hololive enters into English Weiss, so I expect to see these numbers only continue to increase which I mean it's going to be difficult to do, right? You're already sitting at a crazy representation rate.
Hololive is going to have massive representation, if only because it's a very popular property, and it's also quite powerful, right? I'm curious to see what happens with Hololive at Trios. I wouldn't be surprised if every team at some of these regionals in May and June featured Hololive. Like, I think MTI Hololive on the same team is going to be a very common build with something like a Slime or a Ruby or a Bang Dream in that third slot. And also, at the Budapest regional, MTI is not legal because of licensing issues. So in that tournament, there will be no MTI, which will bring down the total meta share. So this number is not going to hold at 25%. I don't know if there are going to be people who are going to play Hololive over MTI, especially in a team format, right? Like if someone brings Hololive, then someone else might bring MTI just because of how powerful it is. Hololive coming out is more going to affect the other stuff. I think that like you're going to see things like Fate, Love Life Sunshine, and Kaguya, which have a certain level of representation, these 1k1 builds, mostly 1k1 builds, that have a little bit of representation. Those are the ones that are going to be superseded by Hololive, kind of as the third player in a team. But yeah, Mushoku Tensei has been dominant, 25% of all decks, 75% of all teams. There are a couple other decks that are playing well, though, and really, like, we haven't talked about Slime, just in general, because of how dominant Data Live and now MTI have been, but Slime is still very present. And it's present in multiple different ways. We're seeing 8 standby, we're seeing the pants level one, like the old package, we're seeing 8 choice. It's kind of all over the place. We're seeing a lot of different slime looks. I think 8 standby is the most common, but it's maybe half of all the slime builds. So slime is still very present in this meta. And we're seeing Bang Dream. Multiple different looks for Bang Dream as well, also getting tops, both of them with 12 overall after 4 tournaments.
I think we don't talk about those as much because those decks are also a little bit more varied than the MTI build, right? The MTI build is very heavily leaning towards that 8 standby build, right? There are a couple builds that are kind of like breakaways from that, but generically, when we're talking MTI, we're looking at 8 standby. The other ones, we're looking at a couple different decks combining together under that same title into that representation number. So if you're looking at specific decks, those numbers would be smaller.
Yeah. And the same kind of goes for Ruby, which is the next one down. A couple of different ways to build Ruby. Most of them feature some kind of standby. Ruby has been quietly very good. It did well at Rumble. It's doing well in Springfest. It's not as powerful as MTI, but it plays into MTI okay, because it can win board because of how big it gets, and it can also decompress. So we talked about this before. Ruby was like one of the biggest winners when Dal got banned. Ruby has a better matchup into MTI than it does into Data Live, or did into pre-ban list Data Live. So Ruby has been, performing well. I think we can expect to see more of that as well. I think Ruby's kind of in that conversation for what's the third deck going to be for you, right? Once MTI and Hololive are out, I think Ruby is going to be a lot of teams' third choice. Fate is in an interesting place right now as we kind of go further down the representation table. 6 decks making top 8. Which is pretty respectable. A couple of them are on the bar top end because with less Dal running around, the Neg-Soul top end is less bad than it was when, you had just unmitigated blink and removal happening all the time. Because MTI doesn't really play like that. So we're seeing a couple of people on the bar top end. It's been on teams with some of the best decks. Like usually when you see a Fate, there's an MTI on the same team. But when we were talking, in previous months about how Fate was more or less unplayable, specifically the bar top end, that was because Data Live was present. But with no Dal, or very little Dal, we're seeing, only 6 in the top 8. Fate can stand to benefit from that. Most people still on the salvage top end, it looks like. But more and more people are teching in the green stuff at level 2. The rider that gets big up to 13 on its own and can blind stock when you get a reverse. And the 2/1 rider that comes down and removes traits. So you can, take a ton of power away from a standby board. That didn't work against Data Live because Data Live had 2 traits on most of its cards. It had the Date and the Celestial Spirit traits. So the anti-trait stuff didn't do anything. But now, because MTI and Slime and Ruby, all the big standby stuff is all, singularly focused on its traits for the most part, that 2-1 that removes traits is suddenly good. And I think Fate now, because it has a piece that can break standby boards, the standby boards that are specifically at the top of the meta, it's suddenly a lot more interesting.
I think part of that initial concern was going to be how relevant was Data Live going to be in Springfest, right? After the ban, what was the representation of Data Live going to look like? And so far, it seems that it's been low. So far, Data Live has been not the meta presence that it once was, which, I mean, understandably so. So with that in mind, that allowed decks that were heavily punished by Data Live to start making its way in. I think that you're hitting on something that's really important to note.
It feels like we're in a meta that is shaped similarly to the way that the meta was around Rumble, where you have one dominant deck and everything else is just trying to catch up to that. But the decks that play well into MTI, or at least better into MTI, are different from the ones that played well into DAO, or at least better into DAO. Like, DAO and MTI are both, they're right now looking like they're about the same level of dominant, with Slime underneath it at that number 2, but then, what 3 through 8 look like. Stuff like Kaguya, right, which honestly matched up pretty well into DAO just based on the numbers from Rumble, but doesn't seem to be doing as well against MTI, especially after getting hit. It's dropped quite a bit. Sword Art is nowhere to be found after being an actual force at Rumble. We've seen 2 Sword Art decks top at all. So we're seeing this kind of churn in the second and third tiers of the meta right now. MTI is still far and away the best, but the decks that are better in tier 2 versus the ones that are now down in tier 3, it's different than the way it was in a Data Live meta. And I think that's really interesting. So yeah, MTI still reigning at the top overall, but a lot of different ways to play Slime, a lot of different ways to play Bang Dream. Those are the decks currently making the most push, but it's still very much MTI's meta at this point in time. So that's it for us. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back on Thursday. We're going to start talking about Holo Live quite a bit. Rares and double rares, 5 cards, 5 minutes on Thursday. On Tuesday, a deck tech, and a week from Thursday, gameplay, all featuring Holo Live. Until next time, thank you so much for joining us. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and have a good one.
We'll see you then.